I think about castles a lot. Perhaps more than I should. Maybe you do too. The reason I bring that up is because there's this moment early on in Kingdom Come Deliverance where you're running towards the town of Talmberg for protection. You see there's this massive army that's just attacked and destroyed your hometown of Skalitz. And you don't know what you're doing. You're just running for your life and you get told to go to Rattay. So that's where you go. While avoiding, getting shot with arrows and watching your town and friends and family die and burn in the background. I mean, the whole thing is actually pretty amazing. I don't want to undersell that. But it got me wondering, the town of Skalitz, which you come from, has its own castle. Why do we think that Rattay would be any better? Do they have thicker walls than they did in Skalitz? Maybe they've got taller towers. The Skalitz one just got overrun and pretty much destroyed. So let's find out if Rattay can withstand an attack. What you're looking at here is Rattay. The question is, if an actual medieval army showed up, would that castle really be any good in a fight? I'm not trying to nitpick the game, and I know that the developers have done their homework, so I trust them. There's a few questions here really that need answering. Where's Rattay located? What kind of a castle is it? Where are its weak points? What are its strengths? How many people can it house? And I suppose if I'm going to stress test this idea, I really need to be specific about what kind of a force that it's going to hold up against. So I'm going to be specific and say that it's this Cuman army that you're fleeing from in the game. They're the ones that we need to test this idea against. Alright, let's take a look. The first thing we need to understand is that castles aren't just fancy houses for rich nobles in the medieval times. Yes, they might own them, but above everything, they're defensive structures. And broadly speaking, when I did my research, castles fall into three main categories. The first one is the Motte and Bailey Castle. These are the earliest designs for castles, and they consist of a large wooden or sometimes a stone structure on a raised hill, which is called the motte. And they're surrounded by a courtyard and a ditch or a moat. They're kind of like simple, fast to build defensive structures, but they're limited in their long-term defensive capabilities. The second type of castle is one called a stone keep, and they're essentially the same as a Motte and Bailey castle, kind of like an upgraded version. They're built in stone or rebuilt in stone with thicker walls, taller towers, better resistance to fire and sustained attack. They're like the Motte and Bailey castle that came to stay. And the third is what's called a concentric castle. These are the real heavyweights. Multiple layers of walls, each one defending the next, and if attackers break through one wall, then they're immediately exposed to another and trapped between the one that they just came through. They're siege nightmares. Think of Minas Tirith. Attackers would be pouring into tightly confined streets whilst being pelted by arrows from above. Pretty grim. Rattay fits most cleanly into that stone keep category. It sits on top of this elevated hill. It's got these thick stone walls with limited access points and a strong natural positioning. It's not the most advanced castle design of the medieval period, but it's exactly the kind of fortress you'd expect in the early 15th century Bohemia. It's a decent, defensible position. In other words, it's not overbuilt, but it's not flimsy either. A lot of this can seem quite abstract when you say it out loud, but because we've been given this lovingly created 3D environment, we're able to walk around and kind of get an appreciation for its scale in a real sense. It's one thing to talk about how large the walls are, but when you get into first person view and you actually look up from a valley and see how tall they are for yourself. Obviously not for yourself, for your character, but it gives you a good sense of the scale of it and how impenetrable these walls really are. And because Kingdom Come Deliverance gives such a realistic, weighty feel to all of the kinds of movements that you do, I had a little go at scrambling up the sides of these slopes and utterly failed. In fact, I fell to my death once, broke both my legs. So I think it gives a decent amount of perspective to how impenetrable these fortresses really are. There's no way you're getting up there with an army. And in fact, there are only 3 entrances to speak of that give access to the interior of the castle itself. You've got one down at the main gate, which is the first one that you enter into when you play through the game. You've got 2 that are up on the upper side next to the training courtyard. I'm going to classify those as kind of one entrance, really. Technically they're 2 entrances, but they're right next to each other, so they're almost the same thing. And then you've got this tiny little entrance which is high up on a steep slope, which is really not an entrance that anybody would use. You could potentially sneak in and out of it, but you're not fitting an army through a teeny tiny little doorway like that. So the amount of access that you've got to the castle is quite limited. And where those entrances are and how you get access to them makes a big difference. If you have a straight run up to the front door, you can charge an army up to it with battering rams and smash the door down and pour on in. But if, like the entrance at the south side of the castle, you have to wind your way up a road and then do a sharp turn at the end to get into it, there's no way you're running in a straight line up there with a battering ram. You'd have to stop, turn suddenly, and then go again, and you'd lose all your momentum, and you're not getting through the door like that. So if an army were to attack, they'd probably come from the high side across these 2 bridges. And the interesting thing about having a wooden bridge in front of your castle is you can burn it down if needs be to prevent anybody from getting across it, meaning that the entrance to the castle is effectively cut off. Then you only have to defend this other entrance, which is tricky to get to and doesn't have a straight line of sight. Pretty smart. Structurally, then, I think Rattay is doing a fairly good job at being a castle. The real question is, how does it hold up under pressure? The story in Kingdom Come Deliverance describes the attacking force of the Cuman army of having a force of in the thousands. You're never given a precise number. But if I do a little screenshot here and we do a little bit of impromptu math, it looks as if we have about 2,000 to 3,000 troops, which is a decent amount of soldiers, don't get me wrong, but it's a fairly small army. But that's the point within the context of what they're actually trying to achieve. They're supposed to be mobile and agile. They're kind of marauding their way through local settlements, trying to convince leaders to switch sides. They're not really there to occupy, they're there to terrorize. So I think 2,000 to 3,000 sounds about right. It might be a conservative estimate, but I think I'm going to go with it for the benefit of this thought experiment. Some of those numbers will obviously include non-combatants like scouts, people following the soldiers, doing the logistics, setting up camp and things like that. So not all of them will be combatants. I'm going to go with 2,500 fighting men. Now, here's another thing that you need to know about castles, is that they're not designed to defeat armies outright. Their function is to outlast them. A castle is not a place where you wage war from, it's a defensive structure, and it's important to remember that. It's not there to send out wave after wave of fighter, attacking the enemy head on. So the focus of the type of soldier that will actually be inside the castle is quite different from the type of soldier that would be in an army. In an army, you'd expect people to have pole arms and swords and shields. Maybe you'd have a few divisions of archers as well, but lots of people on horseback perhaps. When it comes to the castle, you're going to have far fewer people with swords and shields. You're going to have a lot more men with bows. And if I take a look around, you will notice that you don't see many soldiers in Rattay that actually have swords and shields. Most of them do have bows. And that makes a lot of sense because they're here to defend the castle. They're not here to rush out and meet an enemy force head on. This is a really important and crucial aspect of the castle itself. Because if your primary goal is to hold out as long as you can, the one thing that you're going to need more than anything else is food. If you don't have food to last you a long time, and while you're doing this holding out, you're not going to last very long, are you? So food storage matters just as much as A, the amount of soldiers that you have, and B, also their skill. Now, Rattay would have had stored supplies specifically for this scenario. Grain, salted meat, preserved food. Under normal circumstances, it could probably support its population for about a month. And the reason that I say about a month is because if we do another little bit of quick math here, and we count how many houses there are, I count around 15 houses in the inside the walls here. There are more houses scattered around outside, about another 10 I think, and lots of those people would try to make cover inside the town as well if it was being attacked. If they knew it was coming, they'd probably run for the doors, right? So I'm going to make another kind of conservative estimate here and say that there's about 25 houses, each house holding about 5 people, and then add, I don't know, 20% to that because the estimate's probably going to be higher. You get to about 145. Let's round it up and say there's about 150 people living in this area. And actually, that makes a lot of sense. Most medieval towns were between 150 and 300 people. So I don't think I'm very far off the mark if I say there's approximately 150 people living here. So going back to my original thought, which is how much food that they would have had stored, you want to have about enough food to support 150 people for about a month. That sounds reasonable to me. However, there's a little bit of a fly in this ointment, and that is the town of Skalitz has just been destroyed by this very same army, and many of the refugees from that conflict have travelled already through Tarnberg and are here on the streets begging. And that's going to put an additional amount of pressure on resources that are available in the town should they need to go to siege conditions. And if we assume that Skalitz is, I don't know, a third of the size of Rattay, then I think you could probably shave off at least 1 week's worth of supplies to be used within the town. So I'm going to reduce that estimate. I'm going to say it's probably not a month. Unfortunately, because they're having to house these refugees, probably looking at more like 3 weeks worth of food supplies.
I see you survived.
Aren't you observant?
On the other side, the Cuman army have access to the local foraging, pillaging, nearby villages, whatever supplies that they're carrying themselves. And also, remember, they're not settling in. They're kind of just passing through, really. So they're not thinking about siege as a first thought. They're thinking more about keeping up their momentum in their campaign as they're moving through the land. But if they did decide that they wanted to siege Rattay, I am going to very loosely say that they're probably not going to want to stay around for more than a week. And that includes all of their pillaging and stealing of food that they might find lying around in people's houses, and killing the chickens that are stray and things like that. Highly, highly unlikely that they would stay a month, probably more like a week at most. Let me just recap this quickly so it makes sense. The Cumin army is about 2,500 fighting men. Rattay can hold out for about 3 weeks. The Cumin's probably only going to stay around for about a week. Could they breach the walls? Probably not. They don't have any siege equipment, and also it's not really their main goal. But what would happen if they did actually decide to attack? Well, without siege equipment, no trebuchets, no battering rams, although they could make makeshift battering rams by cutting down or felling some trees locally. But the attackers are fairly limited in their options. And the archers, which will be stationed on the walls around the castle, will be picking off attackers willy-nilly, sometimes, probably often missing a lot of the time, but, getting the odd one now and again. You don't want that, death by 1,000 cuts, while you're attempting to break into an impenetrable fortress. But over a week's time, that's going to take its toll. They're probably just going to give up and say it's not worth the effort. The question is, would they breach into the town itself? I think that's probably unlikely. They might make their occasional run at the walls, but it's likely not to succeed. They're not going to be able to take the gates down. Maybe they could build a ladder and get a few men over, but they wouldn't last very long inside the town walls. You could potentially send in some arson and start trying to start fire in the town, or even throw fire over the walls, which is another method which was often used in that kind of time period. But I think a full breach is unlikely. Most realistically, this ends up becoming a waiting game. The attackers camp, the defenders start rationing. We already decided that the castle of Rattay can outlast the Cumin army by approximately 2 weeks, so there's no competition there. And we've already established that the army doesn't want to wait around because that's not what they're here to do anyway. Sieges work best when the attacker is patient and prepared. This Cumin force is neither. They're opportunistic, destructive, and mobile. So unless they commit to staying for a full month, which I highly doubt, it doesn't align with their goals, Rattay probably holds. There wouldn't be anything heroic about it, but they would hold long enough that they would secure a victory. And I think that is the real answer. You see, Rattay doesn't need to be invincible, it just needs to be inconvenient enough that the army decides to move on without spending too much energy on it. So yes, that's my interpretation of it. I think Rattay would survive the Cumin army. Well, that's all I've got time for. So I'll just say, if you have been, thank you for watching, thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you wanted to support my channel, the best thing that you can do is watch one of my videos that's up next. And if you really liked what I had to say, you can join as a member by following one of the links below.